continue talking about the Roman Empire, mostly between the first and the second century. So we'll talk about the peak of the Pax Romana. Mostly I'm going to talk about the Flavian Dynasty, which kind of came into power after Nero committed suicide in 68. And then I'll also talk about a period called the period of the Five Good Emperors, which starts in the late first century and goes up to about 180. So I'll kind of mostly talk about that. And if I have any time after that, I'll kind of get into that as well. So anyway, like I said, I'm going to first talk about this new period that comes in to the Roman Empire, the so-called Flavian period, Flavian Dynasty, which the Flavian Dynasty was the second imperial dynasty of the Roman Empire. You can see it was not around very long. So 69 to 96 CE, of course, was the years that they were in power. And it was only had three rulers that were part of it, you see. Emperor Vespasian, Emperor Titus, and Emperor Domitian. So those are the three that were there. You kind of see a bigger picture of them, I guess, right there. Vespasian at the top right, and then, of course, Titus on the bottom left with Domitian. And by the way, a little about those two. Titus and Domitian were the sons of basically Vespasian. So you see right there. And by the way, it's like the only time where you had a deal at that point in the Roman Empire where you have sons that succeed the father as emperor. That's something that's actually rare. Doesn't happen that often where that occurs. There's a few times I'll kind of talk about it here and there, but it's kind of rare that actually occurs in the Roman Empire. Let me get into the meat, of course, of talking about there. So there's kind of another image showing, of course, the three emperors right there, the Flavians, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. A little bit about the first one, which is right here. So you see there Vespasian on the left. Vespasian was a Roman general under Emperor Nero, and he's the one that would go on to found the actual dynasty in 69 CE. A little bit about him. You see there, he kind of that image right there on the bottom there, but he's well known for fighting in the so-called First Jewish-Roman War, which broke out in 66 CE. We've already talked about this before when I was talking about the history of the Israelites and Jews a long time ago. And he was one of like two main generals that put it down. Him and his son Titus. We'll get to Titus a little later, but Titus, both of them were involved in the defeat of the Great Jewish Revolt. It was kind of all kinds of names that it was called. Great Jewish Revolt, the Jewish War, I think was another name it was called. Remember correctly, all the Jews in Judea and also Galilee had revolted against the Roman Empire because they wanted to be independent, have their own state. So the Romans sent legions in there, led originally by Vespasian, and his son Titus, remember correctly, we talked about this before, sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the city, and along with the Second Temple. It was also burned as well. So I think we had discussed all that. So I think I remember I talked about how it was that famous writer named Flavius Josephus. He was a Jewish Roman writer that wrote about the wars in the so-called Jewish War, the book he wrote. And I think I mentioned how Vespasian had befriended him, Josephus, who was actually a former general in the war, who kind of turned toward the Roman side, and Jews later saw him as a traitor, that kind of thing. So yeah, you got that, and of course I talked about Titus. Titus was one of the main generals that fought in the war, because what happened was Vespasian took power as emperor, and he commanded the forces after that, and finished off the rest of the Jews that they wiped out after that. So yeah, the siege of Jerusalem, 70 CE, which we had talked about before. Let me get into something else, though, that I haven't really talked much about. But how did Vespasian take power and all that? Well, they had this incident that happened between 68 and 69 where a civil war broke out that historians now call it the Year of the Four Emperors. And what happened was Nero's armies rebelled against him. and he was forced to commit suicide. And so you have this case where all these emperors started fighting over the whole empire, like control of it. And so they started, declaring themselves emperors at that point. And here, kind of see them right here. But those are the four emperors that they had. Galba, I think, was the first one that seized power. Otho, Vitellius, and then Vespasian. I'll put the names on the screen so you can see them right there. But Galba, I believe, and also Otho were these two generals that were in control in Spain, in the western part of the empire. Galba seized control first, reigned about 6 months. And then Otho killed him off and seized power. He reigned for about 3 months. And then another general named Vitellius, who I think was in Germany, he took power and killed off Otho. And then he reigned about 8 months until Vespasian killed him off, basically. So they, like one after the other, they killed each other off until Vespasian, seized power. He was victorious in the Civil War. But that Civil War, by the way, is, I think the only major civil war they really have during the whole Pax Romana. So most of the Pax Romana is very peaceful until, of course, Commodus comes in later. I'll talk about him after Marcus Aurelius dies, but I'll get to that later when that occurs. Now, one thing about Vespasian that's very famous, he's well known for building the Roman Coliseum. Most people don't know that, like who constructed it, all that emperor. They think maybe Augustus or somebody built it, but he actually is the emperor that actually constructed it, which they think it was built in a period of like 8 years, 72 to about 80 CE. It's actually called the Amphitheater Flavian. That's the original name of the Roman Coliseum. But if you know what happened was Emperor Nero had built some kind of lavish palace in that area. And there was a huge statue of Nero there that was called the Colossal of Nero. And so the name of this amphitheater became known as the Colosseum, named after that former statue. And so that's where the actual name came from. So got images, of course, of the Colosseum. Of course, probably one of the most famous, tourist attractions in modern Rome today. Kind of talk about a few things about the Roman Coliseum. It was built mostly with slave labor, like I think mostly Jews, from that Jewish Roman War that were taken were mostly used to build it. Now that's what they believe about that. I do have some stats on it I can kind of give you right here, but it's a massive structure. So it's about 4 stories high, 160 feet maybe is the height of like the top of it you see on the left. That's the actual approximate measurement. So 620 feet by 513 feet, or if you want meters, 189 by 156 meters. It has 80 entrances to it, by the way, into the actual stadium. Now, I think it's considered, by the way, to be one of the first stadiums built in the world that you see later, like football stadiums or soccer or whatever. It's built in kind of an oval shape, so it's not exactly perfectly round. It was used for different kind of forms of entertainment. They used it, I guess the main thing that we know of they used it for was for gladiatorial competitions, but it held up to 50, 60,000 people. They think like fans that would watch, all these different entertainment that they would put on, but wild beast hunts, gladiatorial events, which I guess was the main spectacle. They would actually put on mock sea battles. There's theories and stories they've read that they may have filled it with water and had like mock naval battles, put on plays. Of course, they would often execute people in the actual Colosseum. I think there's cases where they would, one thing they would do is I think they would take POWs, they would force them to fight to the death or something like that. And then one guy standing, the guy that's left over, he'd be spared or something like that. So they think a lot of people died in the Colosseum. I think I read 500,000 or more may have died in the Colosseum. And that's over like 5 centuries that it was used, because the Colosseum was used for entertainment between the 1st and the 6th centuries CE. got other images. Kind of look at that right here, but below there's an area called the hypogeum, and it's like an area where they store like cages for like wild animals, lions, tigers, and also where the gladiators would be down there before they would come up to basically fight. But the Colosseum itself has gone through a lot of disrepair. Earthquakes apparently affected it. It caused a lot of it to, fall apart over time. And I think they've made recent repairs to it in the late 20th century. So they've kind of done repairs to it. But I think about 2/3 of the original building still exists. But you can see that part, if you go back to that one right here that I showed, part of the upper deck of it's gone. So you can see only the side. So you see how tall it originally was all around. And they do think it was covered at one point. Was another thing, like a covered stadium. By the way, they do think that Emperor Titus was the one that finished it, and that he opened the first games afterwards. And so from then on, they started having all these public games, which I think a lot of the public games were called like bread and circus, I think is what they were called. It was like mass entertainment, basically to do that. So anyway, I'm going to move on. I want to talk about also the other emperors that were there too, that were famous. You also got Emperor Titus that they have as well. You see right here. Titus, we talked about him already, was this Roman general, of course, that eventually took over after his father died, Vespasian. And I think we talked about him. He was the one that sacked Jerusalem, like destroyed the temple, the second temple of Jerusalem in 70 CE. He's also the one that the Arch of Titus honors. I'll kind of show that a little later. But his brother Domitian would build this famous arch, like a victory arch in Rome, which honors him and all that. But he wasn't in power that long. I think he was only in power like 26 months, Emperor Titus, and he died young of an illness. And kind of talk about a few things that he's kind of known for as emperor. There's two things that really mark his reign, which are kind of like catastrophes. He had bad things happen under his reign. They had two things happen. They had the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that occurred in the southern part of Italy, where Naples is. And then they also had a fire of Rome, like another fire that broke out in Rome in the year 80, which destroyed a bunch of buildings, including the original Pantheon temple burned down that had been built by Augustus. But really the most famous thing that happened was Mount Vesuvius erupted in the southern part of Italy. And a little bit about Mount Vesuvius. Mount Vesuvius is a famous volcano that's in southern Italy. It's about 4,200 feet is the height of the actual volcano. And it erupted on August 24th, 79 CE, destroying several Roman cities, killing maybe like 16 to 17,000 people in that region. They call it Naples. City of Naples is kind of right where it is. Pompeii, Herculaneum, you see there were some of the main cities that were affected by Mount Vesuvius. I've got an image, of course, of the volcano, which you see right there. It has erupted multiple times in history. I think I've got other images right here, kind of a map of where it erupted. So it's very close to where the Gulf of Naples, Gulf of Salerno is, which is on the western side of Italy. You can see Naples is kind of to the north of it. And you can see some of the cities nearby, like Herculaneum, Pompeii, were some of the ancient cities that were back. The Naples didn't exist back then, at the time. But it's erupted before, like during World War II, when the Allies were fighting like Italy and Germany in World War II. It actually erupted in 1944. I think it was the last major eruption of Mount Vesuvius. But the amount of power of this volcano, they say that the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was one of the worst eruptions that happened I guess, in the classical world. And I think the equal amount of power that it erupted, like volcanic ash that it spewed out, was equal to like something like 100,000 times the power of like the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and also Nagasaki in Japan during World War II. So very powerful. This volcanic eruption that occurred. I've got other images. Here's kind of some of the ruins. Now, the ruins of Pompeii, if you know about it, weren't really discovered until modern times, where they started digging it up. Because if you know about the city, it got covered by something like 15 to 20 foot of volcanic ash, like covered the whole thing. Most people didn't die of like lava. It was mostly from the volcanic ash and probably asphyxiation, not being able to breathe because of all the smoke and all that. And so, yeah, you get all these ruins left over where they started, digging it up, the whole city. And so they find a lot of the buildings are still intact, like the road's still intact and things like that. So you can see kind of images kind of here. I'll let you see right here. But of course, the one thing that's very famous, there's the amphitheater, of course, at Pompeii. They find, if you know about it, they found bodies everywhere. People that weren't able to escape from the eruption, where they were kind of left in agony as they kind of died. You can see there. And so I think you took like plaster of Paris and they kind of were able to form the bodies out of it. But one thing that is very famous about Pompeii, and I think also at Herculaneum, was that they found a lot of skeletal remains of like Roman citizens or slaves. And back then, most Romans would cremate their dead. It's one of the things that they would do. So it's kind of rare that you would find actual skeletal remains of humans in Roman times. So that's basically kind of what happened with Pompeii. And there's a lot of refugees that kind of came from that, because of what happened with the actual eruption. Oh, one thing that is famous about the Pompeii, what happened with Pompeii, and the volcanic eruption about Vesuvius, it was actually the first volcanic eruption that somebody actually wrote about it. Because for that, we've had other eruptions they've had. But Pliny the Younger, who was a lawyer at the time and also a writer, wrote a series of letters that he wrote to the historian Tacitus, telling about what had happened. And I think he had an uncle that was called Pliny the Elder. He died in the actual volcanic eruption, but he described his experiences and what the volcanic eruption was like. And so that's why we kind of know a lot more about the volcanic eruption and all that. Compared to others. But yeah, I think by the 19th century, they started doing a lot of actual real excavations, archaeological wise. And so we know more about, of course, Pompeii from also archaeology as well. Now, they also got Domitian. I wanted to talk a little bit about him as well. He, of course, is the last of the Flavian emperors. He's the longest reigning, 15 years that he was in power. He's the younger brother of Emperor Titus, of course, also the other son of Vespasian that comes in. He's kind of an unpopular ruler later. If you know about Domitian, he was this authoritarian ruler that kind of reigned with an iron fist, and he was a total autocrat. That's something you start seeing later with a lot of the emperors, of course, in the future with the Roman Empire. But he did start one thing he did, Domitian, he was a pretty good administrator, and he began rebuilding Rome. Because remember, I told you Rome had burned in a fire in 80 CE. And so he took it upon himself to kind of rebuild it. I think he may have built something like 50-something buildings at one point in the city of Rome. And then I think there was one thing, you can kind of see some of the things he did right here with that. But he's famous for building the Arch of Titus, which he built to honor his brother Titus, who had taken basically the city of Jerusalem during that first Jewish-Roman War. And it was also built by Jewish slave labor as well, along with the Coliseum. So I think it actually has, if you go look on the inside of it, it's actually got pictures of Jews carrying some of the spoils of war back or something like that, or soldiers that are also in there too. But it's something he's kind of famous for building. His reign, of course, if you know about it, he eventually got assassinated. That's one thing about that's kind of famous. September 18th, 96, some kind of court conspiracy eventually led to his elimination, where he was stabbed to death in his palace. And so he was killed off. And so that ended the Flavian dynasty real quick, which didn't reign very long. So reigned 69 to 96 CE. And one of his advisors was put in afterwards named Nerva, I think Marcus Nerva, I think maybe his full name. But he basically will take over afterwards as the actual emperor. Now I'll get to it in a second. Of course, we'll talk about what occurs after Domitian dies. You get this new period that comes in afterwards, which they call it the so-called period of the 5 good emperors, which a lot of historians seem to think that period is like the peak of the Pax Romana, which is like a period of like 80-something years, where you have several Roman emperors that are real popular, not just with the Roman people, but also with the Roman Senate. And it was part of a dynasty that actually was called, it was actually 2 dynasties, one called Nerva, named after that first ruler Nerva that comes in after Domitian is killed. And then you have another dynasty called Antonine as well. And so simply they call it the Nerva Antonine dynasty or dynasties. And however, in modern times, I think in the 16th century, there was this famous writer you may have heard about named Machiavelli. You see on the bottom right, Niccolo Machiavelli wrote that famous work called The Prince, which was like a political treatise. And he coined the term 5 good emperors because he believed that at one point Rome had 5 good emperors in a row, which is kind of rare. And so that name stuck, of course, afterwards. So here's, of course, the emperors, of course, that come in later. The first one on the left I told you about is Nerva. His full name is Marcus Nerva, who, by the way, was a Roman senator that the Senate put in power afterwards. And he would reign only about a year or two, 96 to 98. I think he was pretty old when he died. I want to say 60s, maybe when he died. And he tried to implicate some reforms, I think, into the empire, but he was unpopular because he didn't really have a military background. And so they forced him to adopt a Roman general as his successor. And so that's what brought in Emperor Trajan. You see there next to him. He comes in 98 to 117 and rules. Third one is Hadrian, of course. Emperor Hadrian will be the third ruler. I'll get to him later. He's known for building Hadrian's Wall. Antoninus Pius is the 4th good emperor. And then you have also the last one I'll get to later, which is Marcus Aurelius. Might have been the most famous one of the 5, eventually in the end. He, of course, comes in at the end. They think he rules to what is like the end of the Pax Romana. But let me get to first Emperor Trajan, a little bit about him. Trajan was this militaristic emperor that hailed from Spain. He was like one of the first emperors that came out of Spain. I think he was originally born where now Seville is, Seville, Spain. In fact, Trajan and Hadrian were both from Spain, those 2 emperors, and very militaristic. One thing about Trajan that's very famous, he's known for expanding the Roman Empire further. In fact, under his reign, they think the empire peaks in size, like the largest overall, which I think 117 is considered to be the date of when he would basically do that. And I'll get to in a second, but he conquers a lot of aspects of the empire which are in the east, parts of Eastern Europe, parts of Mesopotamia, and he also at one point took over Turkey as well, part of, I think, the eastern part of Turkey, which they had really conquered at one point. And you'll see that right here. I think I've got a slide showing this, but he had a nickname that the Senate called him, which was Optimus Princeps, actually, was the actual name, which means best ruler, is what it meant. And It's a title he earned because he was sort of a great ruler, and I guess because of all of his conquests throughout the world. And then also, I'll get to it in a second, he's also known for his building projects as well, Emperor Trajan. And he's known for most of his conquests. If you go to this map right here, the areas that he conquered and expanded the Roman Empire were into, there was an area called Dacia, which was kind of west of the Black Sea, where Romania is. He conquered that whole region. So I think I want to say Romania, maybe part of Bulgaria is today. He conquered that area. He also fought the Parthian Empire and was actually successful and conquered Mesopotamia and took it back. So I think they had held it at one point. The Romans had lost it. So he actually had that. And then he also took over Armenia and part of where Georgia is today. But the state of Georgia, you know where that is, where it's kind of like right below Russia and the Ukraine. And then they also think he took part of like where Jordan is today, which may have been one of his last conquests that he took over. So that's the extent of the Roman Empire, they think, in the year 117, when Emperor Trajan died. And they think it's around like somewhere like 2 million square miles or so, maybe the size of the empire, the largest it ever got. Also, the other thing he's known for too, Trajan also built this extensive forum, which became known as Trajan's Forum, and it included like a series of baths, markets. Also, you can see in the middle there, it had this victory column he built that was called Trajan's Column. And Trajan's Column was this victory column he built to honor his military victories in Dacia, like in that area Romania is today. And so that's basically kind of what he became known for. So he wasn't just, this soldier emperor, which is kind of what he was, Emperor Trajan, but he was known for his building projects. He had baths and markets, like Trajan's baths, I think were kind of well known for a bunch of years as well. Then you have Emperor Hadrian. He would be the third of the five good emperors that would come in next. Hadrian was also militaristic too. In fact, he was a cousin of Emperor Trajan. In fact, he married one of, I think, his relatives. I think he married like a second cousin that was related to, basically, to Trajan. And one thing that was different about Hadrian kind of abandoned a lot of the policies of Emperor Trajan. Trajan was trying to expand, the empire as further as he could, but Hadrian went away from that. He decided that they needed more boundaries that were more stable, and so he started fortifying certain areas or putting borders at like rivers or oceans or seas, and that's something that he began to do. That's kind of well known. Got another image right here, of course, of Hadrian. Hadrian also was known for being this very big fond of Greek culture, Greek architecture, Greek literature, the Greek arts, things like that. He was kind of somewhat educated, and because of this fondness for Greek things, he got the nickname the Greekling, is what some people sometimes would call him. And he was kind of an amateur architect, actually designed buildings, built fortifications, like the Hadrian's Wall we'll talk about mostly. And he also built the Pantheon Temple, which was actually rebuilt from the reign of Augustus. So he was known for a lot of things he's kind of well known for. You can see here's kind of an image of Hadrian on the left. Of course, most famous thing that he's kind of well known for is the building of what we call Hadrian's Wall. Of course, it's named for the famous emperor today. Hadrian's Wall, if you know much about it, was this fortification that Hadrian built around the 120 CE in like the northern part of Britain at the time, like northern part of Roman Britain, basically. And it was constructed to keep out various barbarians that were in Scotland that were above, which were mostly two groups. one with the Picts, I think they were called. And then you have the so-called Caledonians, which I think is what they call it later, the so-called Scottish people that are there throughout that region. And the actual Hadrian's Wall, which I've got a map of it right here, it's about 80 miles, at least 80 Roman miles in length is how long it is. I think the actual length of the actual wall is 73 miles in length, like modern miles today, but 80 Roman miles, which a Roman mile is like 0.92 miles, I think, today, an equivalent of it. But you can see it actually ran in the northern part of England, close to where Newcastle upon Tyne is. The Tyne, you can see the River Tyne, that's right there. So that's about where it ran across northern England. I think it's about 117 or 118 kilometers in length, if you want kilometers also as well. So that actually became Rome's most northern border that they had, and it protected, of course, Rome and Britain, like I said, from barbarians that are in the north. Here's other images of Hadrian's Wall, which is right there. So yeah, it's kind of considered, by the way, one of the most famous archaeological features that's still left, in Britain today. It's like one of the oldest things that they have now. And I've got other images of it right here, but the height of the wall varied. I think they say the average height of the wall was like 12 to 15 feet, maybe. They're not sure exactly the height of it. That's kind of debated today, but 12 to 15 possibly was the height of the wall. Today it's been stripped, by up to like modern times. And so I think the height of the wall might be closer to like 6 feet now, what's left of it. And then the actual width of the wall, that varied. I think I've seen 6 to 8 feet maybe being like the width of the actual wall itself that was constructed. And they added like fortifications like, castles and mile castles and things like that to fortify the wall, intervening turrets, ditches, and other things to prevent people from breaking through. But they still had problems where people would still break through from the north. But that's why they had the mile castles. I guess they would have like every mile they would have like a little fortification there where they would hold Roman troops there, and then if they get attacked, they could stop it, stuff like that. So they consider that to be, like I said, the most northern part of the wall. I'll get to it later. They do have another wall that they have, which is called the, you'll kind of see it right there, but it's called the Antonine Wall, built later by Antoninus Pius, another emperor after that. They'll build that one up there and close to where southern Scotland is, but they abandoned that wall, I think Marcus Aurelius came in. So that's the northern part of really the empire, of course, and so you can see it's way up there, like in northwestern Europe, and basically in the middle of nowhere. It's kind of where it was built. Yeah, let me get to another emperor. Wait, well, one more thing I forgot to talk about that's kind of famous, of course, about Emperor Hadrian. He's also known for building the Pantheon Temple. Have you heard about this temple that he kind of rebuilt in the 120s CE? The Pantheon Temple was this Greco-Roman temple that was originally built by Emperor Augustus. I think Marcus Agrippa actually built it under him. And supposedly it honored like all the Greco-Roman gods, which is why it's called the Pantheon, but it burned. Like I think I told you about in 80 CE under Emperor Titus, they had this fire break out. And so I think it got struck by lightning and it burned down. And so Hadrian took it upon himself to basically redesign it and build it, in which he did. And it had a 142-foot dome that was built with it. Here's kind of another image of course, the Pantheon, which you see there. And it was, I think, completed around 125 or 126. I think that's kind of the year they think of when it was completed. And if you know about the actual temple, it's very famous for that oculus, that opening that's in the top of the actual building of the structure of that dome. And it's a big tourist attraction today in Rome. I think I want to say that one in the Colosseum. Those two structures are really the most famous that tourists like to go look at. But it is considered one of the best preserved in the Roman world they have. But one thing about it, if you go back to the image of it, it kind of combines like Greek architecture, with Roman ideas. And so it's kind of interesting. You can see the Corinthian columns on it and stuff. So it looks like a Greek temple, in the front. And it's got this dome structure on the back of it that it's got as well. So that's the so-called Pantheon temple, which, of course, Emperor Hadrian had rebuilt. There's one more thing. I think I've already talked about it before, I believe. But if you remember correctly, Hadrian was the one that put down the Bar Kokhba revolt. I think I already discussed this already before, but 132 to 136, they had one more major Jewish-Roman war that broke out. The so-called Bar Kokhba revolt, where that Jewish prophet claimed that he was the Messiah or something like that. And so it was a bloody, bloody war between the Romans and the Jews. And they think a few 100,000 Jews were killed during that conflict as well. And they think that's part of it. I think I mentioned this before, how they think Emperor Hadrian is the one that started the whole Jewish diaspora, where they forced all the Jews out of, where Israel is now, and they spread throughout the Roman Empire. And so that's something that kind of happened, after the temple was destroyed, and then you have this, of course, happen as well. All right, then I want to talk about, of course, we also have Antoninus Pius, of course, another famous Roman emperor that comes after the fourth of the five good emperors. Antoninus Pius, if you study about him, he's one of the longest reigning emperors of this period. In fact, third longest after Augustus and Tiberius that would reign. So almost around 23 years that he's in power as emperor. You can see there he was adopted by Emperor Hadrian. One thing about the kind of a common thing here going on with these emperors coming in, they have a nickname for the five good emperors. They were called the adoptive emperors, they're sometimes called. So they get this whole succession of being adopted, after that. Antoninus, he was called Pius, by the way, kind of somewhat religious, but there was a deal where he tried to have I want to say his father deified or something like that. And so he got the name Pius because of that afterwards. But he's the founder of the Antonines, which the Antonines is a series of emperors that reigned over this period, which included Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius had a brother named Lucius Verus, and then he had also Commodus. So he had four emperors that were basically in the Antonines. So it's kind of almost like a separate dynasty of rulers. But they do think that this particular emperor was considered really the peak ruler of the Pax Romana, because they think up to his time, very few wars were fought, very peaceful. I think the only thing that actually happened under his reign was that he tried to conquer the northern part of where Scotland is today, which I think he failed. And he just stopped it at where we got this image right here. But he actually built another border where southern Scotland is, where the Firth of Forth is, kind of between England and Scotland. And so he built this turf barrier right there that's about 39 miles long. And so they tried to put the northern border of Rome and Britain there at that point. And I think I've got an image showing part of the Antonine Wall, which was mostly like a wall they built out of stone with turf on top of it, which was built in the 140s. But the Romans abandoned it, I think, after he died. And so they went back to Hadrian's Wall after that. And Hadrian's Wall was kind of used as the northern border to about the 4th, 5th centuries. So, yeah, he's not really known for too much. I kind of go back and talk about Hadrian. Hadrian actually adopted two successors, which were Marcus Aurelius, who was like a nephew through his wife, Faustina. And he was also a Roman general. And then also he adopted Lucius Verus, who was another Roman general as well. And so those two would actually come in and become co-rulers afterwards. But usually Lucius Verus is counted as one of the 5 good emperors. But Marcus Aurelius, of course, is. So I'll talk about him next, which is Marcus Aurelius. So Marcus Aurelius, if you study about him, he's the last of the 5 good emperors that reigns, up to the end of the Pax Romana. You can see he reigned 161 to 180, about 19 years that he was in power. And he did share power with a brother, well, adopted brother, I guess, which is Lucius Verus. He was called, who only reigned for about 8 years, but both were basically like Roman generals that came in. And he actually married the daughter of Antoninus Pius. So he kind of married into their family also as well. So it's kind of weird about that. His mother was basically his stepmother, and he married his stepsister. If you think that's kind of weird, but he did. But anyway, I think she was also a cousin of his, by the way. But anyway, kind of see images, of course, of Marcus Aurelius right there. He's known for a bunch of things. One thing that starts happening under Marcus Aurelius is the Pax Romana starts coming to an end, and they start getting in all these wars. You can see there's actually 2 big wars that kind of break out during his reign in Lucius Verus. They've got the Roman-Parthian War, and then they also have this other war called the Marcomannic Wars that also broke out as well. And kind of talk about first the Roman-Parthian War. The Roman-Parthian War was this war that was fought mostly in Syria and Mesopotamia against the Parthians. The Romans fight the Parthians forever, for many centuries. They're fighting them. And Lucius Verus was sent there to the east. And so he was actually pretty successful fighting against the Parthians. And they actually sacked their capital. The capital of the Parthian Empire was Ctesiphon, which is actually on, I think, where the river Euphrates is. It's actually close to where the modern city of Baghdad is now. And they sacked and took the city, and then they kind of controlled part of Mesopotamia and part of Syria and Turkey after that. And so they kind of regained territory that they had lost, believe it or not, before that. So that was something that he was kind of known for. And I think when Lucius Verus was on campaign in the East, he died of some kind of illness. And so after that, Marcus Aurelius, starting in 166, reigned by himself. Then they had another series of wars called the Marcomannic Wars, where these were a series of wars that were fought kind of in Europe, like close to where southern Germany and Austria is today. And they had a bunch of tribes there, like Goths, Germans, and other tribes that were trying to break into the Roman Empire. And so Marcus Aurelius basically prevented that from happening. But it was a bloody conflict, but it's kind of the future of a lot of wars that are going to come in the Roman Empire, where they're going to have to fight all these Germanic peoples that start entering the empire. And it's what kills off the Western Empire. The only bad thing was they won a lot of these wars, but apparently they brought back an illness from the wars, which were called some kind of plague they called later the Antonine Plague, which some people claimed it was maybe smallpox or something like that. And it started killing off millions of people within the Roman Empire. They think that helped contribute to why the Roman Empire began to decline between the 2nd and 3rd century, because it killed off, like they say, about 10% of the population or more, including Marcus Aurelius. They think may have died of that illness in 180. By the way, one more thing about Marcus Aurelius you may have heard about. He's very famous for a series of personal writings that they call the Meditations or Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And these were a series of writings that were written in 12 books that were about what we call Stoicism, which is a type of philosophy that was real popular in the Roman world at the time. And Stoicism was a type of Hellenistic philosophy that had been spread by this philosopher from Greece named Zeno of Citium. You may have heard of him, who lived back in the 3rd century BC. And apparently under the Romans, there was kind of a neo movement to kind of bring it back, like neo-Stoicism. And so Marcus Aurelius was considered like a student of that particular philosophical movement. And I think sometimes he was called the philosopher emperor or something like that because of it. And meditations has become real popular, in the modern world. A lot of his philosophy and his sayings of Marcus Aurelius, but they think it actually, it wasn't meant to be published. That's one weird things about, meditations. And it was found from, I think, 2 manuscripts that were found in the Vatican Library, I want to say around the 16th century. They compiled into one book, which is now the main, meditations of Marcus Aurelius that's around now today. So there's Marcus Aurelius, of course, kind of a, soldier emperor. Is kind of what he was kind of known for. Now, the only thing was, of course, we'll get to there, by the way, is a victory column that you're looking at right there on the right, the column of Marcus Aurelius, which was erected in Rome later. That was actually erected to celebrate his victories over the Marcomannic, in the Marcomannic Wars. That was actually built by his son Commodus, which of course I kind of talk a little bit about today and get in. Commodus, will come in as emperor. In fact, actually co-ruled with his father for a few years before he died in 180. In fact, 177 to 180, he reigned with his father, and then 180 to 192, he reigned by himself. So you can see there he reigned about roughly close to 15 years as emperor. I just got the 12 years, I guess, as sole emperor I've got listed right there. They think Commodus is the one that they often blame for why the Pax Romana goes away. They kind of claim that he's this emperor that becomes notorious for being maybe tyrannical, possibly. I think there's even some think he may have been possibly insane. And then they speculate Caligula may have been crazy or something like that. But they definitely think Commodus may have been insane for sure. I think he's been depicted that way in a lot of movies and things like that. I think he was also a megalomaniac, and he had this cult of personality that he had about himself, kind of like almost like a version of like Emperor Stalin, like of the Soviet Union or something like that kind of thing. But here's kind of images of him right here on the right. One thing that he's very famous for, Emperor Commodus, if you know about him, would also often participate as a gladiator in the Roman Coliseum. That's one thing he's well known for. In fact, he would participate in a lot of the wild beast hunts and actually fight gladiators, like single combat, things like that. And I think a lot of the competitions may have been fixed or something like that, where he could easily win the actual battle. That's he's kind of notorious for, Commodus, and a lot of the lower classes loved it, but a lot of the upper class thought it was just insane what he was trying to do. It's almost like the president going on TV and wrestling or something like that, and that's kind of what he was basically doing. Then other things started to go bad as well. By the end of his reign, there was a fire again. Rome was struck by another fire in 191, and Commodus threatened to rename and build the city after himself, which is Commodiana, was what he was going to call it. And he started kind of seeing himself as this, I'm the new Romulus and that kind of thing. And so he was kind of off his rocker, I guess, at that point. And some kind of conspiracy formed against him. And so what happened eventually, he was eventually killed, if you know about that. December 31st, I think 192 CE, he was actually assassinated. I know they have that movie you may have seen before, which is the movie Gladiator, where Joaquin Phoenix plays Commodus. Probably may have seen that movie, which came out in the year 2000 with Russell Crowe playing the main character, of course, that eventually kills Commodus. But in reality, I think Commodus was actually strangled by a wrestler, like in the bathtub, and that's how he died. And he didn't die in the Coliseum or anything like that. But what happens with him being killed at that point, it brings in civil war breaks out, and they think that's kind of obvious reasons why the Pax Romana is starting to end at that point. And so you get this thing where the so-called Year of the Five Emperors comes in. Now, I'll kind of talk briefly about what that was basically, and then I'll spend a few minutes also talking about this new dynasty that seizes power afterwards, which is of course called the Severan Dynasty. But yeah, that movie Gladiator was real popular, but a lot of the stories about Commodus, I think a lot of that's kind of made up maybe about him. But he did, fight as a gladiator. That is something he's kind of known for, of course, in Roman history. Now, they have this period that's called the Year of the Five Emperors, which that was actually happened in 193. You had this deal where 5 Roman emperors actually were in power. That's amazing that you have this happen, of course, right there. But you see that there's the 5 right there: Pertinax, Didius Julianus, Pescennius Niger, Clodius Albinus, and then Septimius Severus. So those are the 5, of course, that get into power at that point. And talk a little bit about all those 5 right there. Pertinax, you see the one on the left. I'll kind of blow that up right there. Pertinax, he was a Roman general and also a senator that seized power, and he reigned for 87 days as emperor. And apparently he seized the throne by bribing the Praetorian Guard and evidently didn't pay him enough. And so they killed him off, basically. And so the next guy, Didius Julianus, you see there, the second right there, he reigned 66 days as emperor. Apparently, he won the actual position of emperor through some kind of auction, believe it or not, in the Senate, and he got it. But they turned on him, the Praetorian Guard, and they killed him. And then Pescennius Niger came in. I think he was another, like a Roman general or something like that. He reigned like 1 month as emperor. And then they'd also have Clodius Albinus. I think he was more of a pretender that tried to take the throne too. But he was later killed off by Septimius Severus. And then Septimius Severus, you see on the right, was a Roman general that went back to Commodus' reign, and he's the one that actually would take over. So that's the so-called Year of the Five Emperors, where you have 5 emperors that reign. Believe it or not, later, I'll talk about later, I think in the crisis period of the 3rd century, they have a Year of the 6 Emperors, where there's 6 emperors in 1 year. So totally chaos, with what's going on. So it's obviously the Pax Romana, starting to unravel at that point. But they do have this deal where a new emperor comes in and he kind of, stabilizes things at that point. And that emperor I told you about is Septimius Severus. So he comes in and creates his own dynasty called the Severan Dynasty, you see. And you see the Severans reign for about 42 years, 193 to 235 CE. That they were in power. Kind of see more information about Septimius Severus. He's the one that seized power in the Year of the Five Emperors. Interesting thing about him, first emperor to come out of Africa, like one of the African provinces, and he came from this city in North Africa, in Libya, that's called Magna Leptis. You may have heard of it because there's like ruins of it that are still on the northern coast of Libya. And there's kind of interesting things about him. So he reigned 193 to 211. They think he's some kind of Semitic background. I'm not sure what it exactly is, but maybe part Carthaginian or something like that, possibly was what he was. But he's very famous for his wife. I think I've got images showing the actual Severan dynasty. So they had 5 rulers, actually 6 rulers in it, 6 rulers in the Severan dynasty, Septimius Severus, and then he's got Caracalla and Gata. I'll get to them later. Those are the sons of Septimius Severus. Macrinus was actually this Roman prefect that seized power, that briefly reigned Then Elagabalus and Severus Alexander were cousins of Caracalla and Geta, and they basically also ruled as well. Here's a family tree of the Severan Dynasty. You can see at the kind of top in the left, Severus had this wife he had that was very famous named Julia Domna. Julia Domna was actually pretty powerful as an empress. In fact, some people think she was kind of the power behind the throne. And she even had a sister later named Julia Misa that had a lot of power as well, because she had some relatives that took power later that were related to her. But they think that Julia Domna was related to some kind of Arab lineage, like she was Arab, and she was from Syria, or it's like Syrian part of the Roman Empire. And she had all kinds of nicknames. The Romans would call her the mother of the invincible camps, or she was also called Julia the Pious or Julia the Augusta, I think was other names that she was dubbed. And she had two sons that would reign as emperors, Caracalla and Geta, which you see below Septimius Severus and Julia Domna in that family tree. And those two, it's interesting about Caracalla and Geta, they were actually twins, these twin sons. Of course, that reigned, kind of like Romulus and Remus. That's kind of rare. But I think the only twins that actually reigned as emperors of the Roman Empire at one point. And they co-ruled together, like equals, Caracalla and Geta. But if you know the story about what happened, Caracalla grew jealous of Geta because I think he was more popular, maybe better looking. And so Caracalla had Geta killed. And so Caracalla would then reign by himself, of course, afterwards. I do have an image of Caracalla, which you see on the left. Caracalla was not his real name. His real name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, but he went by this name or nickname Caracalla because he wore this some kind of Roman cloak that was called a Caracalla, and so he got the nickname Caracalla. That's what people called him instead. But he was kind of a tyrannical ruler. But one thing he did do that's very famous, Caracalla, he's the one that issued the Edict of Caracalla in 212, which you see there, which that edict was this Roman edict that basically said that all Romans living within the empire, like free men, could get citizenship. And so they think they did that because the Romans wanted to find some kind of way to increase taxation. And so that's the reason why they did that. And I think also, if you go back to that image right there, also, if you became a citizen, like especially a man, you had to serve in the Roman army. So it was a way to also bring more men in, of course, to serve in the Roman armies. Also, he's known for the so-called baths of Caracalla. You may have heard about that. The baths of Caracalla were a series of baths he built in Rome between about 212 to 216. And I think him and the Emperor Diocletian later were some of the last emperors to actually build Roman baths. They were, real popular that the people used within the city of Rome. And so it's something that he's kind of known for, Caracalla. I'll get to the crisis period in a second, but I might just have to briefly talk about that in a second. But let me go back and talk about some of the other rulers that they had. The Severan Dynasty was very bloody. In fact, out of the 6 emperors, 5 were assassinated, which is true about that. If you go to that image right there, Macrinus, which is in the middle, Macrinus was this Roman prefect that was the head of the Praetorian Guard. He had Caracalla assassinated, and he took power between 217 and 218. And so he briefly reigned, but he wasn't directly related to the Severans. So he's not a relative of theirs, but he would briefly reign. Then what happened was, if you go back to this, you go right to, I think, that image I had of the family tree. There was a woman named Julia Misa. You may have heard of her. She was a sister of Julia Domna. She was able to get her grandson put on the throne which is Elagabalus. And so she put him in power, basically, and he would reign for about 4 years. And I don't know if you know much about Elagabalus. Elagabalus was this emperor that was kind of famous for worshiping a sun god called Elagabalus. I think it was like a type of Roman Arab sun god that was kind of popular in the Roman world. And so he went by that name. And so he reigned for a few years. And he was real well known, by the way, for doing that, but was later assassinated. Then on the far right, they also have Severus Alexander. Severus Alexander was the last of the Severan dynasties. He's also, you can see, the longest reigning about 13 years that he was in power. One thing he's very famous for, he's considered one of the youngest emperors to take power, like around 13 years old when he came to power. And you can see he probably reigned to his 20s before he was assassinated too, also as well. And so that's kind of the affair, of the whole, Severan dynasty, because what ends up happening, you get this period that comes in afterwards. I'll probably be talking about more of this later, but Severus Alexander, his assassination causes what they call the so-called crisis of the 3rd century to break out. And this was like an imperial anarchy period where basically what happened was it's almost like the Roman Empire imploded internally and it almost collapsed. I think it was a case, I'll get to it later, where it actually breaks up into like 3 parts. And it looked like the empire was just going to go away at that point in the 3rd century. But I'll get to it later. It's saved in the 270s and 280s by 2 emperors, one named Aurelian, who puts it back together. And then you have Emperor Diocletian that starts making reforms to the Roman Empire. So I'll talk about that later, of course, in next week. Next week, I'm going to probably wrap up the Roman Empire. We'll talk about the decline of the Roman Empire between the 3rd and the 5th centuries. I'll also talk about how the Roman Empire in the 4th century becomes Christian. That's one thing you'll see. Emperors Constantine the Great, Emperor also Theodosius the Great, they start adopting Christianity. That's something you start seeing where the Roman Empire becomes this Christian state. That'll be, and it also eventually will break up by close to about the 5th century. So that's it for my second lecture, of course, on the Roman Empire. I did have a few students I know that came in. Looks like Zion, I know, came in also as well. Hey, what's going on, Zion? Also, Terrell also joined us today. Henry, looks like also joined us. Some new guys, huh? Kevian, where you been all semester? All you guys. And of course, Marissa, I've seen her before also as well. So that's it, of course, today, lecture-wise. Of course, don't forget reminders, all those different assignments that are out there. But I know you've got the second exam bonus quiz. Make sure to wrap those up. But like I said, 3rd vocab due Friday. Book reports, of course, due next Friday as well. That's it. Looks like there's no comments or questions, of course, about this particular lecture. But if you have a comment, question about the lecture, don't forget you can leave comments, of course, questions either on my YouTube channel or also don't forget Canvas discussions, of course, as well. So that's it for today. Hope y'all have a great weekend, of course, coming up. But yeah, not too many weeks left, of course, of the semester. Next week will be my last live stream lecture. Of course, I'll have, of course, on the end of the Roman Empire. And then, of course, the Middle Ages, I'll probably have recorded lectures, of course, on that as well. So y'all take care. Of course, I'll see you next week.